Welcome, Nick Lozano, to TDC Talks. You've been doing podcasting for almost a year and a half, so we want to get into that. So tell me a little bit about yourself, your journey, what are you up to right now, and what's coming up in the future.
Yeah, so a little bit about myself other than what's on my LinkedIn profile. I know it says I'm a janitor. I'm actually not a janitor. There's a whole backstory to that. So right now, currently, I'm a director of technology for an insurance trade association here in Washington, D.C. I've been here for almost 9 years. Before that, I was a software engineer for one of the big consulting companies. And even before that, I worked in the hospitality culinary industry. That's kind of it in a nutshell without getting deep into my work history because that's not that interesting.
100%. But then you have a podcast on the side, and I see that you're into it, one episode every 2 weeks. And it's super interesting because you're tackling a specific niche that is coming up. I mean, you have a lot of new IT regarding topics, you have new things coming up like aerospace industry, you have all about rockets and scientists coming on, and you also have search engine optimization. You have everything regarding technology. So tell me a little bit about the podcast and how do you get into it?
So the podcast, like you said, it's really, we targeted our market down because if we just did a podcast on leadership in general, like the market's just flooded with that. There's all kinds of content there. So in my day job, my co-host, co-producer, co-founder Brian Comaford used to be at a member firm, and he would participate in. We had a mastermind group here. I don't know if you're familiar with those. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a mastermind group or a working group, and basically for your listeners, it's a group of people who come together who generally work in the same industry or have the same type of job field to get together to help each other solve problems because they generally have expertise that's hard to find, just in a local meetup. So we found that we were having these conversations about technology and how it's changing, and some of these technology leaders are being promoted from the CIOs, the director of technologies, to the CEOs, to being more in charge of companies. And some of these people are lacking the soft skills, the interpersonal communication, the emotional intelligence. Because you think back to somebody who works in technology, and it's a very analytical person who deals with it. Because you think through a lot of logic, and you use your analytical side a lot, and you don't work too much on the you know communication side of it, the leading people part of it. And that's where our concept of the podcast came from, was like we would have these conversations at the end of these working group meetings, and we're like, let's just record this. So our first couple episodes is just us kind of like recording something, throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, which is the way I feel like most people start their podcast.
100%, 100%. And I see that the topics are so insightful. I mean, I was listening to the last one. You were into all the rockets and all of that with scientists, engineers. And I feel that those kind of people are, as you said, they don't have the skills for communication and they get through it. So it's so cool to see a podcast that get the voice out from those kind of engineers and all of that. In our agency, we work with engineering companies, CNC machines, we have aviation companies, and I know how it is to deal with them in the creative space. And I know how difficult it is to get the word across. So it's so cool to see that you have a platform and a voice that you can give them to tell the world what's going on in the IT, all the engineering department and all of that. So tell me, I see that you've been doing this for a year now. How do you get to that point? It's super challenging, I feel, that to commit to at least once every 2 weeks or once a week to post an episode. How do you get to a year mark? I mean, I started the podcast like around in January, but I feel it's a lot of work into it. So I need a team, I need people. So how do you do it?
Yeah, I think that's the one thing. Everyone wants to have a podcast nowadays, right? And then you start doing it and you don't realize how much back end production it actually is, because when you listen to podcasts like a Joe Rogan or somebody who's super popular right now, it's difficult to realize how much back end work that all actually is, because you're only consuming the 15-minute, the 45-minute episode, so you only think it takes 45 minutes. Well, I always tell people that if it's a 45-minute episode, I probably have at least 2 hours into post production just creating the thing. And some of that's by choice because I do some things that people don't do. Like I transcribe the audio, I go back through and throw it in and make sure I have transcriptions for my SEO. And then I write show notes. A lot of people don't, but I write super detailed show notes. But to get back to your original question, is it's just consistency. I always tell people you've got to give your podcast time. A lot of people I feel like give up pretty quickly. They'll do like 7 episodes of like nobody listens to this. Well, of course, nobody knows who you are. I mean, you have to put the time in and do the promotion and just keep showing up. It's a consistency game. Realize that with podcasting, it's you're playing the long game. Discovery still, in my opinion, it's very difficult in the podcasting game unless somehow you have some way to get into the top 10 of podcasting on Apple. It's very difficult to get that exposure. So the easiest way you can do it, and it's something that I failed with in the beginning, is just promotion. Don't be afraid to hop on whatever platforms you're on and just promote it. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be everything that you constantly do, but you need to at least, be willing to put yourself out there and say, hey, I'm doing this. But I failed
100%.
at that a lot at the beginning. Because I'm the kind of guy, I'm like, well, I don't sell people things. So I'm like, I don't want to tell anybody. And then randomly I would have salespeople call me and they're like, oh man, I heard you have this podcast and it's great. Like, why aren't you telling anybody? um, so I would say that the thing is just consistency. Just give it time, promote it.
Awesome.
Show up. If you dedicate to do twice a month, which is what works for me. A weekly schedule is something I can't maintain, but just do it and commit to it. Give yourself at least a year to see if you can build an audience before you decide whether or not it's a go or no go.
100%. I mean, I see that that's something to commit to, and a lot of people are into, getting the likes, comments, interactions right away. And as you said, this is not something that happens overnight, and you have to build it and use the tools that you have available to promote it, as you said. So it's super insightful, and also to put an achievable metric that you can actually deliver. You said, okay, every 2 weeks I have to do a podcast, an episode, and whatever happens, I have to do it for a year. So you have to commit to it. I mean, you have to have the willpower, maybe not go out on Friday night and just stay in and editing, something like that. And that happens. I mean, if you really want it really bad, that's the price to pay. So thank you for that. It's super useful for people that are listening. But now our audience is business owners, marketers, all the agency people. So they all want to start a podcast, as you said. We're in 2020. Everyone was like, okay, I want to be the next Joe Rogan or anything like that. So how do you see the benefits for a business to start a podcast? Do you see it as something that might happen, is something that I should put the time on is not something that's super necessary? How do you see it? Should businesses do the podcasting route, or they should focus on other things?
I think podcasting is a good platform for business, right? For me, I don't do my podcast as a business, but from a business perspective, I think it's still a good idea. You still have to drive value, right? If you're going to be a business and have a podcast, you can't just have your podcast be a 45-minute commercial for your services. Nobody's going to listen to that. I mean, your employees aren't going to even listen to that if it's just a 45-minute conversation about how great your products are and XYZ. um, some of the things that I've seen that works great for businesses is when they talk about topics that, and it's maybe problems that they solve. Like Basecamp has a podcast, for example, which Basecamp's a project management tool. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's been
Yes.
around for a long time, but I can't remember the name of their podcast, but they do all their thing. It's like on communication and the issues with remote teams and the challenges they run into. And then they'll sprinkle in, some things that are like 1 or 2 minute episodes where it's like, hey, this is a new feature we have coming out and we love it because of XYZ. So I would say if you're a business, you should definitely think about podcasting. It's exploding right now, even though people say I can't remember where I heard the stat, but it's like there's a 500,000 podcasts or something like that. But I would argue that some of those podcasts are dead podcasts that people haven't updated in forever. So the market's still small and there's still time to get in that game. It's just got to bring value. It's just like your social media, right? If you try to put up posters of your ads and your services and don't bring value, no one's going to interact with you. No one's going to watch your content. It's the same concept as when you're selling anything. You got to bring value or no one's going to come.
100%, 100%. And if you see it, also the human part of the business. I mean, sometimes people don't know what's going on with Sony cameras or, any TV, Samsung or anything. Imagine if they put a podcast on that they have the CEO speaking or some management officer or anyone that is talking insights about the company, talking about the investor. That's why they do all the earnings calls when they do the stock exchange and all of that. You see them talking about what's going on with the books and all of that. So people would like to see that every once a week, twice a month. It would be super nice to connect with the company in some way, to have those little details. What's coming up next? What's not coming up? What's the competition doing? What they're watching. So it's super insightful for a business to start speaking about anything they have regarding the industry that they focus on. So regarding that, we should pivot into how do you find guests? So let's say that you started your podcast as a business. So where do you find those people? How do you reach out? What's the best platform to do? What do you recommend? How do you find your guests?
Yeah, so for me, I can only go off my experience. So I have a co-host, so that helps some when we can't get a podcast. I have somebody else to bounce ideas off of, like we can bring a topic. So that's the benefit of having a co-host, is sometimes you can get away with not having a guest if you're knowledgeable enough on the topic that you're going to discuss. But the easiest way how we started was we just reached out to friends. Like if we knew someone who was an expert in SEO, and I knew like, hey, let's just get on a podcast. Let's just record this. And, someone who's an SEO is like, yeah, man, well, let's do this right away, because he's all about the social media game and everything. So I would say just in the beginning, it's easier just to reach out to people who are in your own network, because you might have some interesting people who are just in, you know, interesting areas or have interesting jobs or just might be a very good speaker. That's one easy way to start. And then we got in the habit of then asking for references from our guests. We're like, hey, you're a guest on our show. Do you know anyone else who might fit? Can you give us 2 or 3 names, make a warm intro to us for these other people? And then eventually, once we started getting around, like 15 episodes or so, we were able to then just reach out to people because we had a backlog of content. It's difficult when you don't have any content and you just ask somebody to be on your podcast. They're like, well, I don't know what this thing is. Because instantly when you reach out to somebody to be a guest, they then will go back and want to look at your old content. And then you can slowly start leveling up, the, I guess, the capacity of your guest. Like you can go a tier higher each time as you have more guests. And I've had good luck just by being on LinkedIn. That's, for me, that's my target audience. The technology professional, who's on a senior level is already on LinkedIn. So I would just hop on LinkedIn, follow hashtags like leadership, and just constantly leave comments so that people would see me. And if I saw a very insightful comment on something or like a great article, I would just say, hey, this is a really great article. I'd love it if you'd want to be on my show, to kind of discuss this further, and just leave it at that. Don't hard sell, but just like a comment. And if they want to reach out to you and hop on, more power to you. I think it's easy. So to sum it up, it's start with people then ask them for references. And then once you have a back catalog of guests, you can start cold reaching out and start leveling up your guests slowly.
That's super insightful advice. I mean, that's great. And also, I feel that you actually reach to people that you're interested in. It's not someone that's random and like, hey, let's talk for an hour or something. You actually find and focus on a niche that you can deliver on and keep a conversation going. That's super insightful and genuine also. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So after you find your guest, so there are many YouTube videos that tell you, okay, buy this, buy that. There are microphones. You need to have a studio or anything like that. So what equipment do you recommend? Should you just break the bank and spend $10,000 in a studio, or can you do it with a few $100? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so this goes back to I did a whole article on LinkedIn because I saw people recommending multi-$100 of equipment, right? They're like, oh, well, you want to start a podcast, you need a Shure type of microphone, and I'm looking at this microphone. I'm like, that's a $300 microphone. Like what? And it's an XLR input. For those who aren't audio people, it's like a little round thing, and you need special equipment to plug it into. And a Zoom field recorder. I'm like, you don't need any of that stuff to start a podcast at all. You pretty much probably have everything you need to get started. I'm a big fan of when I start things, I just start with what I have. I don't like buying things to just to buy them. I mean, can I have the best, audio equipment in the world? Yes, I can. But if I don't focus on my content, what's the point if it sounds super great in studio quality? So I always tell people, use what you have. Use whatever tools you can have. Try to get by doing everything for free and develop your content, because your content is going to kind of shift as you go along. And then you're going to know the things that are absolutely necessary that you need, and the things that you don't. So I just tell people a USB headset, which I'm talking to you on right now, works perfectly fine. Unless you have, a studio environment like Joe Rogan, where you're going to actually bring guests in and, record them in a studio. Um, you don't need the fancy microphone or anything, in my opinion. You just need good enough quality audio, and then you need to understand how to speak into a microphone. I love headsets because I actually like to write and take notes when I'm speaking to my guest, and it keeps my microphone, I guess, habits in check. I'm always the right distance from the microphone. If I rock backwards, the microphone's always following me. So if I look away or I have to move or adjust something as I'm speaking with a guest, it allows, the microphone to follow me. So in a nutshell, I'd say just start with what you have. And then if you want to up your game, get into more high quality produced content, then buy the stuff. Don't buy that stuff right out of the gate. You're just gonna really waste waste your money.
100%, 100%. At least you can start with what you have, or you can invest in a headset, as you said, and that's more than enough to start. And also, it's super important what you said. I mean, focusing on the content and the guests and having meaningful conversation, that goes a long way at the end. So after you have the equipment that you need, so how do you start producing the podcast? What do you recommend? What platforms, digital tools? How do you use to transcribe the episodes? What are the benefits from that?
Yeah. So for me, from an audio standpoint, so my co-founder is Brian Comfort, and he started a internet radio company in the late '90s called Radio Valve, and he has a broadcast background. So he's like, no, no, we need to nail the audio at some point here. We just can't use Uber conference to record our audio. But we were just starting and trying to figure out what to do. So we were just throwing things at the wall. So for me, I use a tool called Squadcast. It's not free, but for anyone who's not familiar with it, the people who started it, one of the guys is an audio engineer, and that's why I kind of latched onto it, because I tried a bunch of tools and there was these issues with audio drift, which is where audio doesn't line up when you start matching it together, and it creates all kinds of problems. But I use Squadcast to record the audio. It puts everything on separate tracks, and then I do all my audio production in a digital audio workstation, or a DAW as people call them. There's a bunch of them, but I use one called the Reaper, and I put different effects chains onto each of the tracks, with noise gates and a tri-leveler to adjust the dynamics. I'm getting way into audio speak here, but
Yeah.
anyone who's just starting, you don't need to do that. But so I do that. I mix each track separately. And then, I'm lucky enough that my co-producer was also a DJ on electronic music and created music. So all our, soundtrack music and break music is all original content that he created. Um, so, I then get all the timing lined up and export the track to an MP3. I would tell you, whatever you do, people will tell you that the audio quality needs to be super great when you do a podcast, but to me it's not that important, because one, you turn it into an MP3 so you compress it, and then two, you make it mono, because why do you need a stereo podcast when you're only talking? And sometimes when people listen to podcasts, they only have one earphone in. And then three, it doesn't need to be a super high bit rate, because you're trying to just get that perfect equilibrium where you have a good enough sound and that the file size is small. No one wants to download a podcast that's, 200 megabytes and it's a 45-minute podcast. On the back end, people don't notice that, but I always try to think about people in, like third world countries where internet's not as great. If I wanted to reach them, I don't want the audio to be a huge limiting factor of how big it is. So for me, for that, that's, like I produce it. Then I throw the podcast into something called Otter.ai, which lets you do, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's audio. It does audio transcriptions, can do video, can do that. I throw the finalized audio into that, transcribe it all, then export it, and I post all my podcasts on my website, and I post the transcription on my website for SEO as well too. And then I do some other stuff post production. I use like Headliner to create images and videos so that I can upload them to YouTube with the WAV files. And then I also use, Canva. I'm a big fan of Canva. I know how to use Photoshop and InDesign, but what I love about Canva is it's all online based, and I don't have to worry about what computer has Photoshop installed on it. And I make all my graphics in that. So that's what I kind of do in a nutshell.
That's a lot to unpack. I mean, it's a lot you do. I imagine people listening to this, they're really like, "Oh my God, how many things I have to do?" And I work full time. So from what I take from everything you said is, okay, you need to make sure that you have a clear audio. You don't have to be perfect. It can be, you can record from a microphone, and then you can transfer that to your favorite, Pro Tools. If you have anything regarding audio, there are many. Audacity, I think, is for free. You can download that.
Audacity's free. Yep.
Yeah, you can get a free software that you can use. Put your audio in mono. Try to export in MP3, and make it easy for you at the end. I mean, I know you're in a higher tier of podcaster that you already have a year doing it. You have your presets and all of that. But for someone that's listening, just don't get afraid to start and just post something. Some
Yeah, I would say, my workflow is almost like a professional level for doing things, and I wouldn't expect somebody who's brand new to do that. Like for me, the bare minimum is like you said, you can use Audacity. It's free. The one thing I will be forewarn people for using the Audacity is work with a copy of the original file because it destroys the file as you edit it. So just make sure that you save your file in Dropbox or wherever and work off the copy because when I first started doing audio, I used Audacity and messed up a number of files that I didn't have the original for. That's just my forewarning with that. There's great tutorials on YouTube on how to get started with Audacity. It's all open source. So it's a great tool to get started. I would say that that's a bare minimum. Just mix your podcast and choose a hosting platform and upload it. That's the bare minimum you need to do to have a podcast. I mean, you don't need anything more than that. And the next thing I would say is write decent show notes because that's how people find your stuff. If you don't have a big social media audience already to help you kind of drive traffic, just at least write decent show notes with time slots for questions and when things are, and just a synopsis of what the episode is, if just a small paragraph.
Awesome. And let's unpack the SEO part that you spoke. You said that you transcribe your episodes and you use a software for that. What's that important? I mean, should you create a landing page for your podcast? That's how people find you, right? So what do you recommend? What do you use to host your website and all of that?
Yeah, so for me, since first I'll tell people if you're brand new, you don't have to have a website. It's helpful, but you don't need it. Just control what you can control, do what you know how to do, and then work on these things as you go. But for hosting a website, I spun up a server myself on DigitalOcean. I'm a bit more technical than most people, but it's hosted on Ghost, which is another CMS platform. But for anyone else, I mean, you can get a free WordPress site on WordPress.com, pick a template, and throw it on there, and you'll have decent search engine optimization from the get-go. But the reason I like to transcribe it is because Google really loves long content, and a 45-minute podcast on its own will be about 10,000 words, which is, Google will see that and it has tons of content to then find keywords so that when somebody's typing in, hey, I'm looking for a leadership podcast. Um, and then instantly, Google will see leadership words through a bunch of content and start feeding that slowly. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, you're going to need tons of content over time before Google starts suggesting you as even an option. But I liked doing it from the beginning because instantly, like, it would help me figure out all my tags anyways for just uploading my podcast and picking the tags. Especially otter.ai, it will do all the tags for you. It's like, hey, this word was said a bunch of time, this word was said a bunch of time. So you don't have to spend a bunch of time thinking like, well, what should I put this for tag so people find it? Otter will just tell you what to put in there. um,
100%.
but I would say, so if you're getting started, get a free WordPress.com site, at least buy a domain name. But you can get away with the long, domain name in the beginning, and transcribe your audio and put it in there. If you don't know anything about search engine optimization, that's fine. It changes all the time. There's no way to keep up with it unless you're Nilay Patel or somebody like that who's on the cutting edge of it. I would say just transcribe your podcast and put it up on a website. The transcriptions don't need to be 100% perfect. I'm not, a copyright editor, so there's mistakes in there. But when I have guests, I definitely try to make sure that the podcast at least is the words are correct and what they're saying is correct, because it could wind up being quotable later for somebody else. So I try to make sure that at least what they're saying is correct. I don't care so much about what I say, but I would say definitely it will help with search engine optimization. It's just like anything else. Don't expect that you'll do 3 of them and then Google's going to start ranking you in the top of the page. And it's not going to anyways, because people will pay for Google ads and they're always going to be at the top of the search results. So even if you do it all organically, you're still talking like you're going to be 9, 10 on the search result page at most if you don't pay for anything.
That's right.
So I would say, just do the transcription, get a free WordPress.com site, and every time you have a new post, then just put your show notes, your description, everywhere people can find your show in it.
Awesome, awesome. It's super insightful that you said everything lines up in consistency. I mean, if you put the show notes every week or every 2 weeks, you post it and do it for a year, you're gonna see that you're gonna start ranking at some point or another. So don't get over yourself like, hey, what's happening? I'm not ranking, I don't have listeners. Just do the work and put in the work and just don't look at the numbers in the beginning. So that's the best piece of advice that you can get when you start doing something for the first time. Not only podcasting, but social media, digital marketing, anything that you do with your business takes time. Something that's worth having takes time. That's it. That's at the end. So how do you, now that you work with SEO, you have your website, your podcasting running, now the promoting part, do you use social media for that? What do you recommend? What platforms? Are you starting to create strategies? I know you're starting to work from that. You are super active on LinkedIn now. So how do you promote it?
Yeah, so for me, that's probably the one thing I failed at initially in the beginning. Like I told you earlier, I would recommend anyone who's new and has it, just don't be afraid to post your content, or even a text post saying, hey, I've got this podcast, it's about XYZ, check it out. Don't bombard your people on your social media platform with it by posting 4 times a day every day of the week. But for me, my target audience was on LinkedIn, so I've really honed in my, Gary V would be mad at me, but I have all my all my eggs in the LinkedIn basket right now, because for me, it's easy to find the people that I want to listen to my show, because that's where they are. And it's easy for me to see someone who interacts with my content and then go back to their profile and say, hey, this guy, is a developer at, a cybersecurity firm. So I can kind of see if my social media is being successful or not. Whereas other platforms like Twitter or Instagram, it's hard for me to know if that's even a real person, let alone who it actually is. And then I feel like LinkedIn is a bit better. It's still the internet, but it's better area of the internet where people are pretty supportive. If you put something up, if you get great tidbits and content, people are really supportive and interact with it. It's the same thing, like no one's going to interact with your stuff in the beginning. You're going to be talking to yourself, which is fine. Find other people's content, post on it so that people will then start seeing you. And then when you see their content, they'll start finding you. And the other thing I would say is start making small clips of your show. Um, Either audio clips and throw them into SoundCloud and share them that way, or use this app called Headliner where you can make free video clips if you have the ability to, create your own media. It's really great. You can even do it if you don't have media. They have stock images there, and it's free. But I would say, try to repurpose your content to share it. Find a platform. Start with one, and then try to expand your strategy from there. Because what you learn on one social media platform, you can kind of start to try to use that on other platforms. It might not work 100% the same, but you'll have the experience ahead of time of just, focusing in on one platform, knowing what works and what you're good at, to then transition over to something else. Like if you're not good at making media assets, maybe Instagram's not where you want to promote your show. It's just not, maybe Twitter's the better vehicle because, you're better at writing text and you're not good at making videos, transcribing them and putting them in, and Instagram's not the place for that maybe.
100%. Imagine that. I mean, it's great to hear that you use LinkedIn mainly because I feel it's more top line listeners. Maybe you're gonna find on IG, TikTok, or any of those platforms. Like the 18 to 15. But here on LinkedIn, if you have a more mature podcast, you are sure that you're gonna find the listeners that you're looking for. And something that you said is at least once a day post something that's valuable, not promoting always your podcast, some value here and there, and then you promote the podcast and you start growing little by little. Super insightful from you. So at some point when you get the year mark and you start developing or you're more a pro in the podcasting world, you start to find that are ways to monetize the podcast one way or another. Have you started to monetize or you're waiting for it? Do you have any plans for the future? What do you recommend? What have you
Yeah,
listened?
so that's a good question. My co-host and I have this conversation all the time because we have actually been approached by people who want to sponsor the podcast. Um, in my opinion on monetizing the podcast is it's a great thing to do. But between conversations with my co-host and me, I don't think it's the right thing for us. And the reason I want to do that is this goes back to my experience of going to conferences, right? I don't know how many conferences you go to, technology, lunch is always behind the expo, right? And it's like you walk through and people are like, hey, come here, come here, come here. And if I have sponsors on my podcast, I don't want people to think the things I'm saying have to do I'm saying it a certain way because XYZ software company is a sponsor, because for us technology guys, technology companies want to get on our podcast. And I don't want to have a we hardly ever talk vendors anyways, but if I want to talk about a virtual desktop platform and Apple's a sponsor, I don't want people to think that I'm changing the way I'm speaking because Apple is a sponsor of some podcast. And then I also don't like the idea of endorsing something that I don't use or that I've never used. So monetizing is great, but for my co-host and I, we don't think it works. We're using this platform as kind of building our own personal brand to get our thoughts and ideas out there. At this point in time, we're probably not going to monetize, but we'll always reevaluate things as time goes on. If we get start getting into the millions of downloads where cost to host this podcast becomes unattainable. Right now, I do all the production, and my co-host will do all the transcriptions. And then we're hosting on Simplecast, which is like $13 a month. So our cost is our time right now, and the dollar output is not that high. But so if we get to the point where we have millions of downloads and then we're talking hundreds of dollars a month in hosting, then that's a different conversation. But I would say anyone who's new, don't worry about monetizing your podcast right away. If you get anyone who's going to want to be a sponsor on your podcast, it's probably not going to be the right sponsor from the get-go anyways. Just let those naturally come to you and develop over time. And if you host on platforms like Anchor, Anchor can kind of do some of that for you. And what's the other one, like Radio Republic or something like that? There's another one like that where they can inject ads for you. But I would say just don't worry about it initially in the beginning. Focus on your content and then worry about monetizing down the road once you know what your show actually is and who your audience actually is. Because when you're out reaching for advertisement, people are going to want to know right away, how many listeners do you have per month? Like, who is your audience? What's your demographic? And when you're just starting out, you're not going to know those things. And in podcasting, we don't know a lot of that to begin with anyways. We just know downloads, and a download, in my opinion, is not even a metric that somebody's actually listened, because people will have a tendency to subscribe to podcasts, never listen to them, and just let their phone download them all and then clean them out. So, to get back to your original conversation, I would say, monetizing can be a good thing, but start off slowly and find out if it's right for you. And don't worry about it in the beginning. Just worry about your content.
That's right. And I feel it's a long-term game. If you start monetizing from the beginning, you're going to lose a little bit of trust from your audience, because it's going to look, as you said, that you are desperate to get money from them or something like that. So it's better just to wait. And there are many different ways that you can monetize. Some people do the original content route. Maybe if you are an expert in IT, you create a course in IT, so you can plug the course at some point or another to your audience so they know that this is what's going to pay the bills. Also, there are things that, for example, Patreon, or they can donate to the podcast, and you can tell them, okay, listen, I do this full time. I always try to find the best guests for you, the conversations. We put a lot of time into it. Here's our Patreon, and you get access to different tiers. Maybe show notes and backstage conversations that we have with the guests. There are many ways that you can monetize at some point without having the sponsorship from a company or something like that. But it's super insightful that you said to wait and don't rush the process. Just start publishing and just trust the system and just go into it slowly but surely. All right. So regarding the niche, I see that you focus on a single niche. Do you recommend just having, a ton of conversation with different people, or do you recommend just focusing on one niche so you can start building up your audience?
Yeah, I would say to narrow your market down as much as you can. You can't talk to everybody and create your content strategy. Or I can target everyone in the world to listen to my podcast, which would be great if everyone did that, but nobody's going to do that. You need to have some clear set defined of who your audience is to help drive your decisions for content. That doesn't mean that, so I have a technology leadership podcast, but I've had people on there who work in technology in some form of fashion, but they're not necessarily a technology thought leader. And you can find ways to frame that as long as you know who your audience is. So I would say, especially for podcasting, try to narrow it down. You're not going to be the next Joe Rogan. I mean, that guy's been podcasting for 10 years. Just don't expect that you're going to start this and everybody's going to instantly know who you are as a podcaster. For the most part, no one's probably going to know who you are except for your audience. But I would say, narrow it down as much as you can. Think of where you can drive value to somebody, and start there. It might shift and change as your content evolves and as your show evolves. But I would say try to get your niche down so that you can figure out who your show is for, so that then when you go to your social media strategy, your promotional strategy, you know who you're actually trying to get to listen to your show. I always tell people, when you start it, you should be able to describe in a couple sentences what your show's about and who it's for. And that will give you a good idea of, basically who you're trying to target.
100%. Super clear that just focus on a niche and just nail down that kind of people, because I feel that you see it on LinkedIn or Instagram or YouTube. When people start doing different things in one channel, it's kind of tricky, because you never get to one single person, but you get a wide variety of, 100 people instead of reaching 1,000 real followers. So it's super insightful that you said just focus on a niche and just nail down that kind of people. So, one of the questions that I have for you is, do you recommend video podcasts or only audio? Do you combine both? What are the benefits from them?
So I haven't done um, video that much, and some of that's because I don't have a ton of video production skills. Um, I have seen people do it, and YouTube's a great platform, and I've noticed people do listen to podcasts there. And if you pay for YouTube, was it Red or Premium or whatever their paid tier is, you can actually listen to YouTube without having to have the video open on an app. But for me, for podcasting, I always think of audio first because when you think about when people consume podcasts, they consume them while they're driving to work, while they're riding the subway, while they're, outside doing yard work. And consuming audio is much easier. And from a content creation standpoint, it's much easier to produce a higher quality product in audio than it is in video. Video, at least for me, it has a longer production time. I still create a video, but I take my audio and then I use Headliner and I make some graphics and do a little animated audio wave and still put it on YouTube, but that's still not my focus. I like doing the YouTube video, especially for my guests, because it's easier for them to share a single episode. Because when you share out an episode, most of the time in Apple Podcast, it takes you to the landing page for the Apple Podcast. And then if that guest tries to share that as something they've done in the past, 2 weeks down the road for my guest, that link's going to have somebody else's episode on it. So I would say start with audio and then work your way to video. That's just my suggestion. That's what works for me. If you have more video production skills, you come from the video background, maybe it's easier to start with video, create the video, and export the audio um, into a podcast MP3. So I would say do whatever you're comfortable with in both platforms. I've seen consumption both ways, and some of that just might depend on your audience. If you have an older audience, maybe YouTube's not even in the realm of what you should do. It just depends on your market and your audience.
Awesome, awesome. So I see that you're super knowledgeable on the topic of podcasting. You've been doing it for a long time. So where do you learn, new information regarding podcasting? Where do you go to find, do you go to YouTube and just look for podcasting tips, or so if people are super beginner and they want to start learning, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think for me, there's people out there who have paid courses. I have a bit more of an audio production background. I've done some of that when I was in high school. So when I started getting into podcasting, I'm like, well, I already know how to produce the audio, which is probably the major hurdle for most people in producing a podcast, because there's all these terms like a ripple edit, which people are like, well, what's that? And what's a volume envelope? There's all these audio terms, which are, daunting to learn, because then you start going down a rabbit hole. You watch a YouTube video and you're like, okay, well, I just want to edit this audio. And someone's like, well, then you need to create a volume envelope here to lower down the volume of somebody shuffling. And you're like, whoa, 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 what's that? I would say, YouTube is a great platform. Um, there's tons of Audacity stuff on there. It's easier than browsing the Audacity forums to figure out what you need to do. Because sometimes, at least for me, I'm a visual learner. So sometimes seeing someone go through the steps, I can figure it out much faster. Um, so I'd say YouTube, Google, sometimes I always comment, I don't know if I'm good at my job or if I'm good at Googling. so, so I would say just start with whatever. If you're a visual learner, use YouTube, use Udemy, use any of the other platforms that work for you and how you like to learn. And there's tons of tutorials online. You can follow people's websites, and just start basic. Don't go out rushing to buy all the expensive tools and the expensive digital audio workstations before you actually really know what you want to do.
100%, that's right. I mean, there are many free tools out there that you can use. I know some people rush into paying $997 for a course on podcasting, but I just would wait a little bit before that. I mean, there are many resources and free info out there that you can find. I mean, and I find it more rewarding to spend the time and learn and find different tips from different people than just paying one single person to tell me what's the best way to podcast. So that's basically my train of thought when I see all the courses on podcasting and all of that. So I just spend the time in learning the craft from different people, basically. So to close a little bit, what podcasts are you listening to currently? So where do you get your inspo from? You know, Joe Rogan, I see it's a big inspiration person for you. But what else are you listening to at the moment?
So for me, my podcast consumption kind of it comes and it goes because it depends on what my production schedule is. If I'm producing my own content, from an audio perspective, I'm normally not consuming a lot of podcasts, but I tend to listen to different things. Joe Rogan, I've listened to him not all the time because like 3-4 hours sometimes episodes are. In my opinion, he's a very good interviewer, so I listen to him to pick up on his interviewing skills. He's very good at like finding a question in somebody and then digging a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper to get someone to open up to him. So I do listen to Joe Rogan, Jocko podcast, Jocko Willink. I don't know how familiar with him, but he's another pretty popular podcaster. And then I go a completely different route. There's a podcast called 20,000 Hertz, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's an audio production company out of Dallas, or out of, I think the guy's name is Dallas. I don't think they're out of Dallas, but they do sound design and everything. And it is probably like one of the most well audio produced podcasts I've ever heard. But they just bring up, different things on sound and different topics and anything like related to music and, different audio. And then one of my other go-tos is 99% Invisible. I don't know if you're familiar with that one as well, which is Roman Mars, pretty popular podcast. And they just talk about how design integrates into everyday life. And then I would tell people, if you're going to start your own podcast, don't look at these big ones and think that you need to be exactly like them. So I always tell people is like, 99% Invisible is a highly produced podcast with tons of teams behind it. Go back and find the very first episode of that podcast and listen to it and see that the audio quality is something that you can replicate in your own home. Everyone starts somewhere. Like they didn't have these, huge backers with big budgets to, hire professional audio producers and sound designers and sound mixers to create these for them. They were just, most of the time, they were just people who are like, hey, let's start a podcast, and kind of learned as they went down the road.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I feel that so many people get crippled by decision and just like, oh my God, I need everything perfect. But just don't do that. I mean, if you want to start, you just start right away, as you said, with whatever you have, and you can start it going. I mean, when it gets better, you can start buying things, and just little by little, don't be like, I want everything perfect, and that's it.
Yeah, I would say, Maya Angelou has this great quote, and she's like, geez, man, do, man, I can't remember now off the top of my head. It's something along the lines. It says like, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So basically, like I said, just start, right? Don't sit and wait for the perfect conditions for it. You're never going to have the best computer because there'll be another computer in 6 months that's better. You're never going to have the best microphone because there'll be a better one. You're never going to have the best workstation because there'll be a better one. So don't try to have things be perfect. Nothing's going to be perfect. Just start. Just do it.
Yes, well said, well said. So, Nick, where can people find you? Where can they listen to your podcast? And if they want to get on one-on-one with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so for social media platforms, I'm mainly on LinkedIn. I accept every connection request. I haven't been burned by that too much recently, but there's some fake profiles on LinkedIn. But if you're a real person, no problem. So send me a connection request. I'm happy to answer questions about starting podcasting. I've helped tons of people on there with, what equipment do I need? What time frame should my podcast be? So I'm more than willing to help you out. I'm also on Instagram, but mostly for personal reasons. I don't post there very often. And I'm on Twitter, but I'm never really there. So really for me, it's mostly LinkedIn. Just hit me up on there. And my podcast is called Lead exe, and that's a period, so it looks like a Windows application program, and that is on all your podcasting platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, whatever platform where you listen to podcasts, that's where they are. We're also on YouTube as well. We post all our podcasts onto YouTube with just like a single image and an audio wave that goes through, so you can find us there as well too.
Fantastic. And I see that you're doing your video challenge on LinkedIn. You're doing 90 days of video. So if people want to get to know you better, that's the best time to get in. I mean, you're going to have content from Nick every single day.
So, yep, and yesterday I did a LinkedIn Live and still did a video.
There you go. Just giving the content to the people. I mean, fantastic to speak with you, get to know you. We've been interacting for quite some time now. So it's so great that we got the time to sit down and speak for almost an hour. So thank you very much for your time, Nick.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
All right. See you and see you next time. Okay. Take care.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.